Good evening. Tonight we begin with something deceptively sweet. A tiny crystal that tastes like comfort but has quietly rewritten the map of human life. Forget the candy-coated nostalgia. The true history of sugar is stitched through conquest, plantation smoke, forced labour, and the fortunes of empires. The truth is, dropped into the world sugar built, on a Caribbean plantation under the long sun, or in the fevered docks where it was traded. You would find that survival there was never simple. Lives, bodies, and economies were all remade by that white grain. Before you get too comfortable, give the video a like and subscribe if you're enjoying it. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is on your end. It's incredible to see viewers joining in from every corner of the world. Silence your notifications, take a deep breath, and let's begin. On the wet green shoulders of New Guinea, where the rain drums and the air tastes of loam and salt, people first took hold of a reed that was not merely reed but a promise. A stalk full of sweet, seething sap that tasted of sunlight and fattened the mouth with an almost indecent pleasure. They chewed it, as children still do when they steal a length from a field, sucking out bright juice until their teeth frowned and their tongues were sticky. They pressed it between hands and stones, and they found that the bright, cloying liquid could be carried away in gourds. Over generations they learned that some reeds were sweeter than others, that some kept their sweetness longer, and that if you split a cane and left it in the sun, it became rich and syrupy. Those small repeated choices, to plant a cane from the sweetest stalks, to keep the juiciest tillers for seed, to favour thick internal weeds over thin, are in slow human time what domestication looks like. A conversation across centuries between people and a plant in which both species change to better speak to one another. Botanical and genetic work in the last decades has traced the family tree of Saccharum with reasonable certainty. Saccharum officinarum, the thick-stemmed species that would become the parent of most commercial sugarcane, blooms from the islands of New Guinea and neighbouring sections of Southeast Asia. Its wild cousins spread outward. Saccharum spontaneum in the humid plains of the Indian subcontinent, other species across Polynesia and the Asian mainland. Phytoliths, residues trapped in sediments, and the linguistic fossils embedded in Austronesian languages, Malay Tebu, Tagalog Tubo, Polynesian cognates, tell the same story that the genes do. This was a plant that moved with people by watercraft, carried in the same hulls that bore pottery and pigs, spreading as the great maritime peoples of the Pacific and Indian Oceans pushed their horizons. Archaeological sites on the highlands of New Guinea, the places of early taro and banana cultivation such as the famous glades and wetlands that archaeologists sometimes point to as proving grounds of agriculture in that island world, hold the faint traces, worked soils, repeated plantings, seeds selected from the sweetest stalks. It is not a dramatic moment with a single discoverer. It is a series of small decisions in which sweetness was chosen because it fed children better, sweetened bitter medicines, and could be used as a gift. Those early uses were immediate and pragmatic. Chewing was the earliest refinery, the mouth is a mill, human teeth and saliva beginning the process of extraction and partial fermentation. Then came the stone and the wooden presses, simple rollers that squeezed juicier stalks into bark and clay vessels, and with them the knowledge that juice, once liberated from its living sheath, did not last. Time and heat became the first technologies of preservation. Boil the juice, the water evaporates, the liquid thickens, the sugars concentrate. In different places, people learned different endpoints for this reduction. In New Guinea and across parts of Southeast Asia, the sweet mass might be poured into leaves to cool and solidify into a dark, soft block, easily carried and hung as an offering. In other regions, it was the syrup itself that travelled, poured into gourds traded by canoe along the coast. The process that would much later be celebrated and cursed as the manufacture of sugar, the concentration, clarification, and crystallization of cane juice, began as a string of little human solutions to a persistent problem, make the remarkable thing portable and durable. We can see traces of these choices in the archaeological record and in the oldest texts that touch the subject. Vedic literature, much of it composed centuries before Christ and compiled across the Indian subcontinent, has a word that is unmistakable. Iksu, sugar cane. It is not a casual botanical note, it is a named object within the economy of offerings, foodstuffs, and ritual. Later Sanskrit medical writings associated with the Ayurvedic tradition, the compendia and treatises that would change shape and content across the first millennium of the Common Era, record sweet sap as both nourishment and remedy. The physician-surgeons and their texts, practical documents intended to be used in the sick room and the field, treat sugar not merely as a taste but as a pharmacon, an agent for calming, for preserving medicaments, for balancing what they called the humours or doshas. So too did sugar become part of daily generosity. It was a substance that could be parcelled, gifted and carried, a portable sweetness meant to be given as token, and to be placed in ritual bowls as prasad, edible blessing. From these modest islands and marshes, the cane rode west and north with people who were, in many ways, the first long-distance agriculturists, Austronesian sailors and traders. Their voyages, a millennia-long procession of outboard journeys and island settlements, carried yams, banana cultivars, taro and sugar cane to the farther reaches of Southeast Asia and beyond. At every port of call, local experimentation continued. In the broadlands of the Mekong, along riverbanks in what is now Vietnam and Thailand, in the island chains of Indonesia and the Philippines, methods that began with chewing and pressing acquired a new sophistication. Earthenware kettles large enough to hold the juice of many stalks, hearths that could reach steady, controlled heat, and an artisanal eye for the moment when viscous syrup would set to a paste. The product took on regional forms, in some places dark, grainy jaggery, in others finer pastes used to glaze and conserve food, in others still early attempts at sugar that would later be coaxed into crystalline form. India, with its dense populations, long agricultural history, and urban centres of learning, turned this experimentation into something more systematic. Here the cane was planted in managed fields, timed by monsoon cycles, and irrigated by small-scale systems of bunds and channels. The logic was administrative as well as agricultural. Granaries and treasuries found it useful to catalogue the plant that could be converted into a commodity, whose weight and form allowed taxation and transport. In the classical and post-classical eras, Indian agronomists and administrators made careful note of varieties, best practices, and yields, a sort of practical knowledge that would later be copied and transformed elsewhere. Some early administrative texts and land revenue accounts include references to cane as a taxable crop. Farmers who planted it were not merely feeding their households but touching an economy. But the single most consequential technical advance that occurred in the subcontinent was the move from syrup and paste to a crystalline sweet. The act of making a sugar crystal is, in essence, a patient exercise in control. You concentrate the juice until supersaturated, remove or combine impurities that would otherwise prevent neat lattices from forming, and then allow crystallization to begin, sometimes deliberately seeding it. Indian confectioners and sugar workers learned to coax cane juice into discrete transportable grains that could be moulded and stored. The word they used, sharkara, referred to grit or gravel, and the term would travel with the product as it moved out of South Asia and into the wider world. The other term, kanda, meaning chunk or piece, pointed to how this sugar was often shaped, into small, firm lumps that were more convenient than a sticky, perishable syrup. These words did physical work as well as linguistic work, and so they were carried by traders, translated into Persian and Arabic, and from those tongues into the languages of the Mediterranean. We know about these Indian technologies not only from the residue of jars and hearths, but from the texts that Indian scholars and physicians produced. Sanskrit medical and technical treatises describe the properties of sugar and its preparation. Travellers' accounts, written by those who moved through ports and markets, mention the sugar of the Indian coast as something both delicious and economically valuable. Greek and Roman natural historians too had heard of cane from the merchants. Theophrastus and later Pliny discussed a sweet reed from India. though their knowledge was fragmentary and often mixed with rumour. By the turn of the first millennium of our era, however, Indian know-how about extracting, clarifying, reducing, and crystallizing had made sugar into a commodity, no longer merely a local delight but an exportable good. It was in the kitchens and workshops of the Indian subcontinent that certain practical solutions became routine. Pans of copper or iron were used to boil the juice down, and some material was added to clarify. To make the bright syrup less cloudy and help separate the molasses from the crystals, the use of lime, calcium compounds, as a clarifier is attested in later agronomic literature and makes sense chemically, since a small alkaline addition will precipitate some impurities. Millstones and later roller presses were used to extract juice efficiently. Animal and water power were harnessed to turn these machines. Moulds, cones or cylindrical forms allowed the concentrated sugar to cool into a shape that could be handled and shipped. All of these procedural steps were practical answers to logistical problems. Cane went bad quickly, transport was slow, the markets were distant, and so the product that survived would be the one that could be stored and shipped. This knowledge did not remain Indian for long. With the rise of the Islamic empires and the expansion of Muslim traders across the Indian Ocean, sugar went east to west. The Arabs encountered Indian sugar through trade long before they transformed it into an industry within their own lands. But the Arab conquests and the trade networks that accompanied them, especially after 712 when the Umayyad general Muhammad ibn Qasim reached Sind, intensified contact. Merchants, engineers and scholars moved between ports with a surprising effusiveness for the time, carrying seeds, implements and recipes as casually as they carried spices. The word shakara became shakar in Persian and sukar in Arabic, a small mirror of the larger transfer of technique and taste. Once Arabs and Persians had seen the methods, they began to adapt and innovate. The great cities of the early Islamic world, Baghdad, Basra, Fustat in Egypt, Raqqa and later Cordoba in Al-Andalus, were nodes not only of trade but of technical experimentation. Arab engineers and agronomists began to build larger mills, often powered by animals or water wheels to crush more cane in less time. They improved heat management in the boiling process, arranging sequential pans so that juice could be concentrated stepwise, and they developed clarifying techniques that made cleaner, whiter sugar. Treatises on agriculture written in Arabic, and later translated into Latin and vernacular languages, describe the cultivation of cane, the layout of fields, and the steps of manufacture with surprising specificity. The great agronomist Ibn al-Awwam in 12th century Al-Andalus, for instance, wrote at length on the cultivation of cane and its processing in a way that shows both the inherited Indian methods and the local refinements being made in the western reaches of the Islamic world. Water management was an essential part of this transformation. The sugar cane that produced the sweetest juice wanted water at some times and dry soil at others. It was not a crop for fallow fields. Islamic engineers brought qanats, norias, and the systematic use of irrigation channels to regions like the Fertile Crescent and the Nile Delta, allowing cane to flourish in places where rain would not have been enough. In Egypt, the Nile's annual generosity could be managed and channeled into vast beds of cane, and in Mesopotamia the old Sassanid and Abbasid canal systems were repurposed and extended. The result was to create, sometime between the 9th and the 12th centuries, a series of sugar-producing regions under Islamic control, the Nile Delta and Fayyum, parts of southern Iraq, the Levantine coast and the Iberian polities of Al-Andalus. It is tempting to imagine these innovations as purely technical, but they are also linguistic and cultural. The words for sugar in dozens of Middle Eastern and Mediterranean languages are etymological footprints of this movement. Shakara to shakar to sukar, and kand or kandi, a Persian term for crystallized sugar, leading to the Romance and later English word candy. The sweets of the medieval Islamic world, early halva-like pastes, fruit preserves and syrups, show intimate knowledge of how sugar could preserve and transform foods. Culinary culture, hospitality rituals, and medicinal practice absorbed sugar, and in turn sugar's production became organised into larger units. Sugar houses near fields, mills with specified roles, and the slow emergence of something like a factory at scale. From North Africa and the eastern Mediterranean, the product and its craft travelled further into European consciousness. Europeans in the late antique and early medieval world knew sugar in a scattered way. Roman texts described a strange Indian reed and probably small amounts of syrup traded to the wealthy. Honey remained the common sweetener. But it was the Islamic Mediterranean that brought sugar within reach of European elites. Sicily and Al-Andalus were the corridors of this transfer, and here the story becomes clearer and more consequential for Europe. Arab rule in Sicily, beginning in the 9th century after the Aghlabid invasions around 827 and consolidated through the following centuries, brought intensive agriculture and the full apparatus of irrigation and agronomic skill to the island. Sicily became a place where the techniques of the Eastern sugar world were transplanted and adapted to local conditions. The island's warm climate and fertile soils, fed by sophisticated irrigation, made it ideal for cane. After the Normans conquered Sicily in the 11th and 12th centuries, the new rulers were less interested in failing to tax the island's productivity than in learning from the people who had been there. They retained much of the agricultural bureaucracy, and sugar remained an important export. Sicily, thus, is one of those historical nodes where an Islamic technological achievement was absorbed into a Christian polity and then integrated into European economic life. Meanwhile, in the Iberian Peninsula, Al-Andalus, with its vast irrigated plains around Seville and the Guadalquivir Valley, had become another European cradle of sugar. The Arab rulers of Cordoba and later the Taifa kingdoms had already encouraged the cultivation and processing of cane. Sugar became a product that local and international merchants coveted. When Christian kingdoms slowly reconquered parts of the peninsula over the long centuries of the Reconquista, they found functioning sugar economies in some places. These would later be appropriated, adapted, and moved like many medieval technologies as the political map of Europe shifted. The Crusades, beginning at the end of the 11th century, were a further vector. Western knights and merchants arriving at Levantine ports encountered sugar as part of the urban diet, a commodity in markets, a product in gardens, a feature of the sweets and medicines offered in hospital and court. They took this knowledge back west, sometimes literally carrying sacks of sugar, more often carrying the desire for it. The Crusader principalities on Cyprus and in the coastal Levant became new centres for cultivation, because the climate and the irrigation possibilities supported cane. When Richard the Lionheart captured Cyprus in 1191, he sold it, passing it on to new rulers who would find the island suited for sugar production. The Lusinian kings of Cyprus would, in the centuries that followed, develop plantations that fed a growing European demand. Trade networks adjusted. Genoese and Venetian merchants, those great mediators of Mediterranean commerce, found it increasingly lucrative to move sugar from eastern ports and island refineries to markets in northern Italy and beyond. By the 13th and 14th centuries, Venice had become a key hub, its merchants and their warehouses acting as the filter through which sugar reached the courts of Europe. The commodity's weight and volume made transport expensive. A loaf of ore had been manufactured precisely so that it could survive a long journey by sea and still be sold at a profit inland. Sugar therefore remained a largely urban and aristocratic indulgence for a long time. It was used sparingly for medicine and for display as much as for taste. Apothecaries, who were among the first to import sugar in any quantity, valued it because it made medicines more palatable, and because sugar itself had been ascribed curative virtues in both Islamic and classical medical texts. The social meaning of sugar in medieval Europe was as important as its physical properties. Where once the sweetness in a household came from mead and honey, now the ability to serve sugar signalled access to distant trade, to wealth, and to a cosmopolitan palate. On the tables of the great, sugar was used with a kind of architectural pride. It crystallized into tall conical loaves and brightened the colours of sugared fruits and spice-coated nuts, arranged like townships on a banquet table. The art of the subtleties, the sugar sculptures that popped at late medieval and early Renaissance feasts, was not merely confectionery but a sign language of prestige. To display an entire miniature fortress of sugar was to display one's command of the economies that brought the raw material to one's table. These displays were ephemeral, ultimately dissolving on the tongues that ate them. But the message they transmitted was durable. Medieval households and institutions also used sugar in a more sober register. Monastic infirmaries, urban apothecaries and courtly kitchens made medicines and preserves with sugar that allowed perishable fruits to cross seasons, turning them into confits and conserves that could be dispensed throughout the year. Sugar's hygroscopic nature, its ability to attract and hold moisture, and its preservative power made it an ideal medium for syrups, electuaries and cordials. Physicians trained in the Galenic tradition, often via Arabic translations of earlier authorities and the writings of figures like Avicenna, prescribed it for certain ailments. The Latinized medical corpus that spread through the universities and the literate clerical classes carried advice about sugar's use. In that way, the sweet substance had become embedded in Europe's learned traditions. Logistics, always the silent partner in any economic revolution, shaped where sugar could be produced and who could profit. Cane had to be milled within hours of harvest. The pressing and boiling stages demanded fuel, water and skilled labour, and the finished product required secure storage and reliable shipping. These demands made sugar production an enterprise of coordination. In Sicily and Al-Andalus, irrigation and existing agrarian organisation allowed cane to flourish. In Cyprus and parts of the Levant, coastal humidity and access to shipping made plantations commercially viable. But even where conditions were technically favourable, sugar remained a product that needed capital investment, merchant networks, and jurisdictions willing to protect and tax an industry that touched commerce at many points. That is why the early European sugar industry clustered where it did, along sophisticated trade routes and in polities that had the administrative capacity to support it. The presence of sugar also reconfigured what riches looked and tasted like. Where a noble's table had once been judged by the variety of game and the quality of vinegar and salt, how a new element, white, crystalline, foreign, represented a worldly reach. Sugar began its ascent as a luxury and slowly worked its way over centuries into broader consumptive patterns. The link between its rarity and its social meaning was deliberate. Merchants and rulers understood that scarcity generated value. A pinch of sugar at a banquet was both seasoning and sign, and as demand rose among courts and the mercantile classes of Europe, the networks that supplied the sweet changed their shape. From Indian and Arab hands through Mediterranean brokers to the warehouses of Venice and Genoa, and then onward by caravan and ship to the inland markets of France, England, and the Low Countries. When one stands back and traces the weave of these centuries, a pattern emerges that is at once simple and vast. A plant domesticated in island swamps became an agricultural object of art and science in South Asia. That art and science was shared and reworked by Islamic engineers and entrepreneurs, and from there the commodity moved into Mediterranean Europe as a luxury and a tool of medicine. Throughout, the same logistical imperatives, water for the cane, mills for the press, fuel for the pans, ships for the trade, shaped where sugar could grow and at what cost. The sweetness that began as bite and sap had become, by the medieval period, a crystalline economy, a technology of concentration that required capital, organisation, and the creation of new tastes. It is easy, speaking softly and at the end of a long day, to romanticize the story, to imagine every step as a quaint human discovery. But there is a quiet irony in the narrative that lengthens the tale. From the very beginning, sweetness was not only a sensory delight but a problem to be solved on a large scale. Making sugar into something that could feed a city, sweeten court medicines and be displayed at feasts required more than clever cooks. It demanded engineers, water managers, merchants and administrators. The reed that a child chewed on a New Guinea riverbank was the seed of a global commodity chain, because humans chose to make it portable, and once that choice was made, it began to shape landscapes, diets, and economies in ways no one could have guessed. So the reed became a lump, and the lump became a loaf, and the loaf began quietly to rewrite human needs and hierarchies. From the first tribal gardens and the slow work of selection in the Pacific to the simmering cauldrons of Indian crystallizers, through the mills and irrigation channels of the Islamic world, and into the banquets and apothecaries of medieval Europe, sugar had travelled both physically and culturally. It arrived in Europe as a rarity and left as a promise that sweetness could be standardized and moved across seas to feed taste and pay taxes. The reverberations of those choices, agricultural, technological, and commercial, were still unfolding, and the taste for sugar, once planted in the palates of the wealthy, would prove stubbornly contagious. When the first stalks of sugar cane were steered across the Atlantic, they arrived not as a botanical curiosity, but as a proposition about land and labour, about the taste of distant markets and the price one would pay to sweeten them. Sugar had already been a Mediterranean and Asian commodity for centuries, cultivated and refined by Arabs, Venetians and Iberians. By the 15th century, Portuguese planters had learned to turn islands into factories on Madeira, and then, with alarming efficiency, on the smaller outposts of the Atlantic like the Canaries and the Azores. Those early plantations were laboratories of a new kind of agriculture. Timber was stripped, terraces laid down, mills built to crush the green stalks, and labour organised around the heat and rhythm of the boiling house. The pattern that took root on Madeira, large-scale monoculture, capital investment in fixed machinery, and dependence on coerced labour, would be copied and enlarged until it remade whole continents. After 1492, the transplant accelerated. Columbus and his successors did not invent the idea of planting cane in the New World. They carried it to a soil that was not yet exhausted by war or disease, and whose indigenous peoples, ravaged by epidemic and conquest, could not supply the numbers to keep plantations running. Spain and Portugal had already learned to turn small Atlantic islands into sugar factories. The Spanish settlers on Hispaniola and Cuba, the Portuguese in Brazil, the French on the western margins of Hispaniola, the English and Dutch when they pushed into the Caribbean in the 17th century, all of them began to see in the broad green rows of cane the simplest route to hard currency. By the 1520s there were functioning mills in the Caribbean. By the late 16th and 17th centuries a new Atlantic geography had formed. Madeira and São Tomé gave experience. Pernambuco and Bahia in Brazil became the great early colonial engines. Barbados, Jamaica, Saint-Domingue, Martinique and Cuba followed. Each island and coastal plain a crucible in which European capital and tropical land were fused into something commercial and relentless. This was not accidental, it was strategic. European merchants and colonial governors realized that the world's appetite for sweetness could be converted into a predictable flow of bullion. The machinery of empire, charters, land grants, monopolies, and a maritime system that shipped goods, people and money in three-legged voyages between Europe and Africa and the Americas, reorganized the Atlantic into a single economic circuit. Sugar was the ideal commodity for that circuit. It could be stored and transported, it fetched high prices in European markets, eager for novelty and luxury, and it scaled. A single estate with a mill could produce more than a dozen independent fields of grain. What began as a crop for well-to-do households rapidly became the first truly mass-produced tropical export. The commodity whose scale forced a reordering of land, labour and capital on both sides of the ocean. The ecological consequences were immediate and unmistakable. Forest after forest fell, not in warfare but in calculation. In the dense, dark Atlantic islands and along the coastal plains of Brazil and Hispaniola, planters cut the canopy to plant cane in straight, sunlit rows. On Barbados, the topsoil, poor to begin with, thinned under the relentless demands of repeated planting. Bees of soil, microorganisms and humus were brushed away by erosion. In Saint-Domingue, plantations reached into the plains and onto the slopes, and the hills that once held woods became terraces of cane. Brazil's sugar frontier marched inland, consuming the Atlantic forest as production moved from exhausted coastal soils to newly cleared terra firma. The pattern repeated. Once fertility declined, planters pushed outward, cutting more forest, sometimes switching to new tracts when yields fell, sometimes abandoning worn-out estates. The consequence was a cascade of ecological change, soil exhaustion and erosion, the silting of rivers clogged by bare earth. The loss of biodiversity as hedgerows and native species were supplanted by a single plant that fed markets, but not the varied life of the land. Monoculture carried its own slow poison. Cane draws copious nutrients from the soil, and when the fields were planted year after year without rest or rotation, yields fell. Pests and diseases, once contained by a varied landscape, found uninterrupted corridors. Small mills and boiling houses that had once contended with seasonal fluctuations were now surrounded by the sameness of cane stretching to the horizon, a green sea that looked benign until the harvest when the labour it required was revealed. Ecological transformation refracted into social organisation. Land was parcelled into contiguous estates rather than scattered holdings. Hedgerows and commons gave way to fenced plantations. The notion of property was simplified into long fields and central factories, mill wheels, boiling houses with their furnace heat, curing sheds where raw dark sugars were left to dry. The plantation was a machine made of earth and human labour. That machine meant labour, and in the Atlantic architecture of sugar that labour was organised through coercion at a scale that has few parallels. From the 16th century onward, the plantation complex imported an enormous labour force from Africa. Numbers matter here because they tell a tale of scale and logistics. Over the 3 centuries that made the Atlantic world, historians estimate that roughly 12 to 13 million Africans were embarked on transatlantic voyages, with around 10 to 11 million surviving the crossing to the Americas. The transport of human beings was itself an industry. Pharaohs of European merchant ships, brokers, forts and coastal hold yards, places called barracoons, where captives were held, inspected and sold. Manufactured goods from Europe, textiles, metalwork, alcohol and firearms were the currency of exchange. Ports such as Liverpool, Bristol and Nantes grew fat on the traffic. Lisbon, Amsterdam and Bordeaux were central nodes. Merchants in these cities financed ships, insured cargoes and insured human beings as if they were packed goods to be lost and recovered. The Middle Passage was a central link in the Atlantic system, the network that bound European merchants to African suppliers and American estates. It was organised with grim efficiency. Slaving slavers sailed in circuits, often touching multiple African ports to assemble their human cargo, then made the crossing with routes timed to winds and currents that would expedite delivery. The shipping logs are a catalogue of commerce and calculation, tonnage, chain capacity, insurance policies, and notations of mortality that were read by merchants as risks to be managed through provisioning, medical beliefs, and all too often, the callous calculus of profit versus human life. Mortality on the voyage could be high, sometimes 10 to 20% on average, and that figure became a variable in the wider political economy. Islands with extreme mortality could not reproduce their own labour, and therefore required perpetual replenishment. This was true of many Caribbean colonies, which, under the pressure of sugar's brutal regime, became dependent on a steady stream of new arrivals from Africa. Once they landed, the logic of sugar dictated labour systems that were designed to break bodies and wills while extracting maximum value. Planters developed a range of labour regimes to do that. There was the gang system, seen across much of the British Caribbean. Groups of workers, often chained by time and overseer, performed continuous labour from dawn till dusk under a strict regimen that prioritised speed of cutting and crushing. There was the task system in places such as parts of coastal South Carolina and sometimes Cuba, where enslaved workers were assigned a quota of work and, if completed, might have a modicum of autonomy for the remainder of the day. In Brazil and the Spanish Main there were hybrid forms, seasoned by local law and custom, by the existence or absence of communal labour systems, and by the skills that enslaved Africans carried with them. Seasoning, the process by which new arrivals were broken in, acclimated, baptised into a plantation calendar, and often rendered more docile through disease and starvation, became a grim routine. Mortality rates on the estates were high enough that new captives were not merely a labour force, but a continual input to maintain production. This necessity shaped demographics. In the 18th century, Saint-Domingue, the French colony that occupied the western half of Hispaniola, became the richest European possession in the Americas because it produced sugar and coffee at an unparalleled scale. By the late 18th century, it was home to roughly 500,000 enslaved Africans and their descendants, who worked a landscape of plantation monoculture that supplied a substantial portion of Europe's sugar. Its wealth was obvious in the classical port warehouses, the ships laden with sugar barrels, the private fortunes of planters. Yet that wealth was little more than a ledger line built on human replacement. In many British islands, the enslaved population did not, for a long period, reproduce at a rate sufficient to replace itself. Life expectancy for a newly arrived field worker could be bewilderingly short in the face of hard labour, disease and the deprivation of basic provisioning. Only in some parts of mainland America, notably the American South, did an enslaved population come to reproduce itself sufficiently to reduce dependence on new imports, a demographic variation that was itself a function of climate, disease ecology, and modes of labour. It is impossible to describe this system without noting how it reshaped Africa. The slave trade was not simply theft en masse. It involved reshaping African polities and economies in mutually reinforcing ways. Coastal and intermediary states emerged, adapted and sometimes thrived by participating in the trade. The Asante and the Gold Coast, Dahomey on the Bight of Benin, the Oyo Confederacy and many smaller polities engaged in wars, raiding and capture as methods of producing captives to sell. Firearms flowed in return, altering the calculus of power and making war more lethal. Demographic distortions followed. In some regions, men's absence left gaps in labour and reproduction. In others, the selective removal of particular age groups and sexes shifted social structures. The longer-term consequences were subtle and profound. The commodification of human life reoriented certain African economies toward export in ways that complicated later development, and it left behind divisions and memories that would inform political narratives for centuries. Culturally, the plantations were sites of creolization, the mixing, wuhaus, often violent and coerced, of African peoples from different ethnicities, languages and traditions, together with European languages and indigenous survivals, produced new Creole societies. Those societies invented languages, spiritual systems and political cultures out of improvisation. In Haiti, this became Haitian Creole and Vodou. In Brazil, it fed candomblé and the rhythms of samba. In Cuba, African-derived faiths mixed with Catholic ritual to produce Santeria. In the low country of the United States, Gula communities retained distinct speech patterns and crafts that testified to West African roots. Culture was a kind of resistance and creativity folded into everyday life. It allowed the oppressed to carry forward identity and to shape new communal forms, even as planters sought to erase origins and particularities in favour of an anonymous workforce. Resistance came in many forms. There was everyday resistance through work slowdowns, sabotage, feigned illness, and the keeping of spiritual and cultural worlds beyond the oversight of planters. There was the formation of maroon communities, autonomous settlements founded by runaway enslaved people, like Palmares in Brazil, where for nearly a century fugitive communities resisted Portuguese and Dutch incursions until Palmares fell in 1695 under the crushing of a colonial campaign and the death of its symbol, Zumbi. There were organised revolts with larger consequences. The Stono Rebellion in South Carolina in 1739 sent shockwaves through colonial legislatures. Tacky's Rebellion in Jamaica in 1760 was fierce and widespread. The Haitian Revolution, beginning in 1791 and concluding with the establishment of Haiti in 1804, under leaders such as Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, was the most consequential. It not only ended slavery and colonial control on that island, but also reverberated through imperial calculations across the Atlantic. These acts of resistance forced colonies and metropoles to rethink security, law and labour. They hardened racialized legal codes even as they exposed the untenability of a system built on continuous coercion. Those legal codes are themselves a revealing history. The French Code Noir of 1685 did to regularize slavery in the French colonies. It demanded baptism into Catholicism, defined slave status, and, in practice, set the boundaries of permissible coercion while leaving enormous discretion to masters. In Barbados, the Salive Code of 1661 and subsequent legislation crystallized British colonial expectations about property and punishment. Spanish and Portuguese realms had their own edicts and complicated systems of caste and manumission. These laws both reflected and produced racial hierarchies. As slavery matured into a system that spanned generations, it required ideology to justify itself, and that ideology hardened into racial thinking that later provided pseudo-scientific cover for unequal treatment. The plantation became not merely a place of production, but a crucible where modern notions of race and labour were forged and defended. At the same time, the material needs of production and the incessant demand for more productivity at lower cost drove an equally relentless technological evolution. The earliest sugar mills in the Atlantic world were simple affairs, a set of wooden rollers turned by oxen, mules, or human muscle, pressing juice from chopped cane. The Portuguese called their production units engenhos, engines of sugar, because they married the field to a central mechanical heart. The mill, the boiling house, the curing shed, the storehouse. Where rivers allowed, water wheels were adapted. Where wind was abundant, planters raised windmills, the sails turning to crunch cane. The Dutch, in their period of dominance in parts of Brazil and the Caribbean, brought engineering approaches to the mill that improved throughput. In Barbados, too, windmills dotted the landscape, but all these power sources had limits. Wind was fickle, animals tired, and water power demanded topography many islands lacked. The seasonality of cane harvest and the need for rapid processing before sucrose degraded meant that any delay translated into loss. What the industry needed was reliable, fungible power. Enter steam. The Industrial Revolution of Britain provided a new engine for sugar. James Watt's improvements to the steam engine in the latter 18th century and the proliferation of steam power by the early 19th century meant that plantations could install engines whose rotation was constant, powerful, and independent of the weather. Richard Trevithick's high-pressure engines, appearing in the early 1800s, made compact, durable power plants possible. By the 1820s and 1830s, steam-driven mills began to appear across the Caribbean and in Cuba and Louisiana. Steam reorganized the factory. Mills grew larger, engines required workshops and engineers, and the maintenance demands created new layers of skilled labour. The result was a further concentration of capital. A sugar estate became not merely land and a workforce, but a small factory complex, and its proprietor a manager of machinery and credit lines as much as a planter. Wherever steam arrived, output rose and cost per tonne fell, which in turn pushed rivals to mechanise or perish. Mechanical changes did not stop with power. The chemistry and physics of refining advanced too, in ways that increased yield and improved quality. Early sugar-making boiled juice in open coppers until crystals formed. This method lost sugar in the form of molasses, an often degraded product through overheating. The early 19th century saw the introduction of technologies that changed that dynamic. Vacuum pans and the multiple effect evaporator allowed processing at lower temperatures, reducing caramelization and preserving sucrose. Norbert Rillieux, a Creole engineer born in New Orleans in 1806, studied in Paris and by the 1840s had devised a multiple effect evaporating system that used steam economy to concentrate cane juice efficiently and safely. Rillieux's innovation, matured in the 1840s and put to practice in Louisiana sugar houses, reduced fuel consumption, lowered labour needs in the kettle houses, and improved the yield of crystallizable sugar. It was a technical advance that had social consequences. It reduced the choke points in processing that had made estates so vulnerable during harvest and made it possible to scale operations without linearly increasing the hearth labour. Another revolution was the centrifugal machine, a device that separated molasses from crystals through rapid rotation and thereby hastened the conversion of raw to refined sugar. With centrifuges and improved clarifiers, planters and refiners could produce whiter, more marketable sugar in less time. That made colonial sugar even more competitive in European markets where refinement mattered for price. Diffusion processes, which used hot water to leach sucrose from cut cane rather than crushing it in rollers, began to appear in the later 19th century and further increased extraction efficiency. The sum of these changes was dramatic. Between the late 18th and the middle of the 19th centuries, the sugar industry moved from a craft-like, labour-intensive set of steps to a more mechanised, capital-intensive factory model. Machines did not remove the need for human work. Cane cutting, for instance, remained stubbornly manual until the 20th century, but they did shift where labour was needed and what skills were required. These technological shifts reshaped social relations on the plantation and the politics of capital. Large steam-driven mills and the associated evaporators required significant upfront investment and reliable credit. Consequently, planters became clients of European banks and merchant houses. They mortgaged estates, sold bonds, and linked their fortunes to the fortunes of financiers in Liverpool, Paris, and Lisbon. In the Caribbean and Cuba, foreign capital from Britain and France flowed into sugar, and Cuban planters often partnered with British and French commercial houses to finance steam engines, boilers, and shipping. The result was the rise of vertically integrated sugar firms that owned cane lands, mills, refineries, and even ships to take sugar to market. Vertical integration reduced transaction costs and allowed firms to capture margins at multiple points in the chain, concentrating power in fewer hands. Where the old Ingeno might have been a semi-autonomous estate, the new sugar company was a business enterprise whose ledger book mattered as much as its acreage. Mechanization also had political consequences after emancipation. When Britain moved to abolish its slave trade in 1807, and then slavery itself in the 1830s, planters found themselves without the perpetual supply of new labour that had sustained Caribbean production. In many places they adapted by investing further in machinery and consolidating land. In others they sought alternative forms of labour control, indentured labourers from India and China, systems of debt peonage, and legal manoeuvres that rearticulated wage relations into forms that approximated servitude. In Cuba and Brazil, where slavery survived into the latter half of the 19th century, Cuba not abolishing slavery until 1886. Such investments in machinery meant that when emancipation finally arrived, there were industrial complexes that could, in some cases, transition to wage labour and survive. In the United States South, the different demographic trajectory of the enslaved population and the slower pace of mechanization shaped another path. Here, the planter class remained economically and politically powerful through the antebellum period, and sugar refineries and mills in Louisiana continued to rely on very large concentrations of enslaved labour until the Civil War. The irony is bracing and bitter. Sugar, refined into a white, crystalline form that gilded breakfast tables across Europe and later made tea and coffee palatable for entire populations, was the product of a chain that concentrated capital and mechanization on one end and flattened land and lives on the other. Machines, steam engines, vacuum pans, centrifuges allowed planters to extract more sugar per acre and per worker. They also required concentrated capital and technical knowledge. They made plantations into industrial sites whose failure was a matter of finance as well as of weather. The environment continued to bear the consequences. Mechanization could not cure degraded soil and could, in many cases, accelerate the pace at which new land was felled and put under cane. Monoculture, bolstered by machines that lowered per-unit costs, made regions more vulnerable to market swings. When prices fell, indebted estates could be sold or consolidated, and the cycle repeated. Through the 18th and 19th centuries, sugar's story is one of compounding effects. Ecological simplification, permitting high yields demanding more labour and more land, labour supplied through a trade that displaced many millions from Africa, and technological advances that intensified production while concentrating capital. The Atlantic became a theatre in which plantations were both site and symbol, site of production, symbol of a world remade by appetite and finance. Ports that once traded in spices and olive oil now handled casks of molasses and bales of refined loaves destined for consumption patterns that would never again be the preserve of the elite. Sugar moved from luxury to staple, from a spice to a common factor in diet and industry. It fed factories, sweetened diets, and fueled other trades, including rum distillation, which itself fed the triangular trade with yet more exchange goods to Africa. These are facts that sleep uneasily together. The technical ingenuity of improved boilers and engines, the precision of naval routes that timed slaving voyages to harness winds, the legal codes that sought to justify slavery while administrators argued over insurance claims and the fiscal profits of customs duties. Names appear in the ledger books and histories. James Watt at the dawn of the steam age, Richard Trevithick refining high-pressure engines, Norbert Rillieux reinventing the boiling house, Toussaint Louverture rallying insurgent armies in the hills of Saint-Domingue, Zumbi of Palmares resisting for decades in Brazilian backlands. Cities and regions carry the imprint: Liverpool's docks, Nantes's warehouses, Recife's harbours, the planters' great houses that sat like small palaces above their fields. Each advance in technology or organisation changed the calculus of scale. Each revolt, each law, each ship moving out of port altered the arithmetic of empire. And so sugar rewrote human history not as an accident, but as a concatenation of choices, botanical transplantations and colonial strategies, clear-cutting and capital, the brute arithmetic of human cargo, and the subtle, efficient mechanisms of boilers and centrifuges. The land remembers in its stripped hillsides and eroded plains. Cultures remember in Creole tongues and syncretic faiths. Economies remember in the ledger lines of ports and merchant houses that bartered continents. The machinery that steamed and spun in the boiling houses was only one kind of engine. The larger engine, of appetite, of credit, of political will, kept the plantations running until social and political forces, from revolt to reform to industrial innovation, reconfigured the balance of power. Listen and you can hear it. Not only the hiss of steam through copper pipes, nor only the creak of a windmill, but the quieter, more enduring noise of systems setting themselves in place, of forests felled for rows of green that stretched like a promise, of ships that threaded the ocean with human cargo, of laws that sought to give order to what they could not morally justify. It is a long tale, told in the language of engineers and of merchants and of those who resisted. It is, in other words, human history in a single commodity, the white crystal that tastes of sweetness on the tongue, but whose history is bitter, complex, and astonishingly decisive in how the modern Atlantic was made. The mills ran like slow drums against the grey northern sky, and in their long, humming shifts the labouring bodies of Manchester, Salford, Preston, and the other cotton towns became dependent on a small crystalline thing that arrived in sacks and casks from half a world away. Sugar, once an exotic spice parcelled in little amounts for the courts and the wealthy, had by the later decades of the 18th century been turned into the cheap commodity that could be bought by the spoonful, and by the middle of the 19th it was one of the foundational calories of the industrial working class diet. In those factory towns a worker's day began and ended with tea, and tea without sugar was thin consolation. A crust of bread spread with jam and a lump of sugar gave a child the courage to stand another long hour at the mill, and a handful of toffees kept a man's teeth and temper occupied between the whistles. The change was not merely gustatory. It was logistical, strategic, infrastructural. The price of sugar tumbled because of the scale of plantation agriculture in the Caribbean and Brazil, because of transatlantic shipping developed to move sugar, coffee, and the labour to produce them, and because refining technology crept forward enough that granulated sweetness could be made ready for the urban palate in vast quantities. Cheap sugar supplied rapid calories in a form that was easy to carry in a mug in a pocket, and thus sat unobtrusively at the heart of the industrial labour regime. To imagine the scene, Dawn over the mill towns, blackened chimneys, steam seeping from wheelhouses, the bell clapper sounding for a shift change. Women with hair tucked back and aprons dusted not only with flour but with sugar crystals. Children's mittens sticky where they had been sharing sweets. There were tea shops and stalls outside gates, gallons of hot tea poured into tin mugs, a spoonful of molasses, or a white lump of refined sugar dropped in to sweeten it and to give the brain a quick carbohydrate spike to face a 12 and sometimes 16-hour day. Bread and sugar, jam and tea, these combinations became the shorthand of the new urban appetite. The caloric logic was perversely straightforward. Industrial labour demanded long hours of steady effort. Sugar supplied quick energy at a price that poor wages could meet. Employers, reformers, and temperance activists all noticed the effect. Employers sometimes provided tea for their workforce, a small pragmatic measure to dampen the appeal of pubs and to keep hands from the machinery more steady. In Birmingham and elsewhere, Quaker proprietors like John Cadbury, who had opened his grocer's shop in 1824 and moved into chocolate manufacture in the following decades, pushed tea and cocoa as moral alternatives to drink. The Quaker industrialists, Cadbury in Bourneville, the Rowntrees in York, would later style themselves as paternalists who improved the lives of their employees in part by shaping what they consumed. But long before model villages, they had ridden the currents of taste and price that made sugar ordinary, not aristocratic. That ordinariness was engineered. London's Isle of Dogs saw the rise of the West India Docks in 1802, constructed under the direction of merchants such as Robert Milligan, to secure and speed the reception of sugar and other West Indian produce. Liverpool and Bristol, long hubs of the Atlantic circuit, became mercantile engines where sugar changed hands, was refined, and was distributed inland by cart and canal. The docks were a kind of sugar distillery for the city. Bonded warehouses held the casks and loaf sugar, brokers issued warehouse receipts and bills of lading, and the smell, a mix of molasses, tar and the sour sweet dust of granulated sugar, rose from quay and warehouse into the London air. Refining itself became an industry. White loaves were turned into crystalline sugar ready for household use, and new machines and methods, centrifugal machines, the vacuum pan, more effective lime clarification, meant refineries in London, Liverpool and Amsterdam could convert raw cane sugar into white sugar for the masses. The result was the steady availability of sugar in the marketplaces of towns that had been built around spinning frames and coal-fired forges. This steady availability remade consumption patterns. In the first decades of the 19th century, the East India Company still monopolised tea imports, but the monopolies and the shipping networks that had made tea expensive for the poor began to loosen. The EIC's monopoly over trade was finally abolished in 1833, and tea became progressively cheaper and more widely available. Combine that with the sugar from the Atlantic, and the ritual of tea and bread took on a civilizing and disciplining role in the factories. A mid-morning cuppa gave a worker a short, calm respite, sweetened and warmed, a ritualized recovery of attention. Coffee houses had centuries of history in European urban life, but the working-class tea culture of 19th century Britain, bread, butter, jam, tea, sugar, became a practical fuel for the industrial body. Indeed, the sugar-sweetened tea functioned both physiologically and politically. It raised blood sugar, lifted spirits, and became, in the eyes of factory owners and municipal reformers, a bulwark against drunkenness and social unrest. The temperance movement loved to praise the virtues of tea, not least because it could be sweetened with a spoonful of plantation product rather than drowned in spirits. Confectionery, too, took on new proportions. The sweet shop became inseparable from the working-class street. Old family businesses, such as Fry of Bristol in the later 18th century, grew into the mechanised firms of the mid and late 19th century. John Cadbury's small grocer's shop in Birmingham evolved into the Cadbury Chocolate Works that would later relocate to the greenfields of Bourneville. In York, the Rowntree brothers opened their enterprise in 1862 and built a confectionery empire that sold chocolate and sugar-laden candies to an increasingly literate urban public. These brands did more than supply treats, They reorganised urban labour economies, offering small, affordable luxuries that workers could buy with pocket money earned in the factory. Short-term pleasure translated into regular purchases, and regular purchases built predictable markets. There were also technological innovations that neatly fit the industrial schedule. The sugar cube, invented in 1843 by Jakub Krzysztof Rad in what is now the Czech Republic, a modest domestic convenience according to legend born when the governor's wife burned her fingers cutting a sugar loaf, made portioning sugar easier, faster, cleaner. One can imagine tired hands fumbling for a lump in the dark, and the cube's tidy efficiency answering a small human need produced by mass production elsewhere. The taste for sweetness also changed what people ate at home. Marmalade, commercialised by the Keeler family in Dundee at the close of the 18th century, became not simply a luxury but a way to preserve fruit and to add calories to the poor man's breakfast. Jam and preserves, candied peel, treacle puddings, toffees wrapped in paper. These things made a little sweetness go farther. They made calorie-dense meals for the family that could be prepared quickly and were portable for the worker who had only brief breaks. It was a modern diet in a sense, optimised for time, for energy return, for the demands of scheduling and production. The social and moral discourses around these foods were complex. Doctors and social reformers sometimes warned that excessive sugar would rot teeth and corrode virtue, but those admonitions rarely outweighed the immediate economic logic. A spoonful of sugar was cheaper than a day's wage, and it bought the worker another hour of output. The tiny crystal, then, was a lubricant for the gears of industry, a small indulgence that supported enormous systems of labour. There is an irony here that would have warmed the tongue of a wry historian. The same commodity that had been a symbol of aristocratic display in the 17th century became the pacifying ration of the 19th century factory. Cheap sugar quieted appetites for expensive leisure, while also creating whole industries whose profits fed into the same industrial economy. The Quaker confectioners who advocated temperance and paternalistic welfare were simultaneously building brands that depended on sugar's continued low price. For workers, the rituals of tea time and the convenience of sweet snacks knitted together social habits and workplace discipline. For merchants and the manufacturers, sugar was raw material, credit line and margin. If all of this was quietly moving inside cities, sugar's louder business took place in the counting houses and royal courts. What made sugar cheap, what made its granules fall into the worker's cup, was the political and financial architecture stretching from Lisbon and Madrid to Amsterdam, Bristol and London. For 2 centuries the sugar trade was governed by mercantilist rules. Navigation acts, monopoly charters, royal concessions. The Dutch West India Company, founded in 1621, the English Royal African Company in its later 17th century incarnations, and the South Sea Company with the Asiento contract awarded by the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, all these institutions treated sugar as a resource to be defended and leveraged for national advantage. The Navigation Acts meant that sugar grown in English colonies should be carried in English ships. It was not only a commerce but a matter of sovereignty. The result was that European capitals became connected to plantation economies through law as much as through ships. Tariffs and bounties were recipes by which states marshalled capital toward preferred producers and cut rivals off. Those tariffs were not merely economic niceties. They were political instruments that provoked conflict. The Molasses Act of 1733, designed to favour British West Indian planters by taxing molasses from competing French islands, was direct irritant to New England merchants who relied on cheaper molasses from elsewhere. An irritant that found expression in smuggling and contributed to the brittle politics of empire. The Sugar Act of 1764, tightened and revised under Prime Minister George Grenville, sought to collect more revenue from the colonies, and among its many consequences was the aggravation of colonial opinion toward parliamentary authority. In that way, sugar policy had an indirect hand in the growing crisis that led to American independence. Across the Atlantic, Spain and Britain, France and the Netherlands fought over islands where sugar plantations yielded more immediate profit than distant continental possessions. Warfare in the Caribbean, amphibious campaigns during the 7 Years' War, the seizing and returning of islands in the Treaty of Paris in 1763, the strategic gambits of the Napoleonic era, all reflected how much imperial interest was bound up into sugar's production. The financial innovations that surrounded sugar were no less consequential. Sugar was the cargo for which merchants wrote credit and for which bankers insured voyages. Lloyd's of London, which grew from Edward Lloyd's coffee house in the late 17th century, underwrote the risks of Atlantic shipping. Hurricanes, privateers, shipwreck and rebellion. Insurance premiums reflected the riskiness of the trade. The triangular trade, manufactured goods from Europe to Africa, enslaved people to the Americas, sugar and other produce back to Europe, depended upon schedules of credit and repayable bills of exchange. These bills, discounted by houses in Amsterdam, Bristol and London, spread the risk of the plantation across European balance sheets. Merchants like John Gladstone in Liverpool, who in the first decades of the 19th century acquired plantations in Jamaica and invested heavily in sugar estates, exemplify how mercantile credit turned into landed colonial investment. Gladstone later became a prominent political figure, and his fortunes demonstrate that sugar money found its way into property, politics, and polite society in the metropole. The commodity markets for sugar developed structures that resembled modern financial markets: brokers, futures-like arrangements, warehouses that stored and certified sugar, and lending secured on cargoes yet to arrive. Amsterdam, with its centuries-old commodity trading, and London, whose docks and exchanges matured through the 18th century, hosted the paperwork of a global trade. Credit was the lifeblood. Merchants extended it to planters to finance next year's planting, to ship owners to outfit the next voyage. The sugar trade thus financed institutions that became the backbone of imperial expansion. Banks, insurers, and merchants whose capital could be diverted toward fleets, colonial settlements, and the purchase of political influence in European parliaments. State actors recognised the link. Wars and diplomacy were as often about protecting the market for sugar as about dynastic or territorial gains. The Asiento controversy that dogged early 18th century diplomacy in the War of Jenkins' Ear between Britain and Spain in 1739 were, in part, disputes about access and monopoly in the Atlantic trade. And then there were the shocks that redrew the map. The Haitian Revolution, beginning in 1791, erased at a stroke one of the planet's most productive sugar colonies. Saint-Domingue had been the jewel of the French colonial empire. Its plantation output provided a huge share of the world's sugar before the revolt and the Revolutionary Wars. The loss of Saint-Domingue's output cascaded through markets, driving prices, redirecting capital, and prompting other colonial powers to intensify production elsewhere. Brazilian, Cuban, and British colonial sugar economies expanded to fill the vacuum. In turn, the Napoleonic Wars and the continental system of 1806 closed markets and disrupted shipping. Continental Europe, now more than ever separated from British maritime trade by war and blockade, found itself short of cane sugar and eager for alternatives. It was in that vulnerability that a temperate solution emerged. The story of beet sugar begins, quietly and scientifically, with Andreas Marggraf in Berlin, who in 1747 identified sucrose in the sugar beet. Marggraf's discovery lingered as an interesting laboratory result until practical men and states found themselves pressed by geopolitics. Franz Karl Achard, one of Marggraf's students, took the laboratory into the field, opening an experimental sugar beet factory in the Prussian town of Kremen at the turn of the 19th century, around 1801, with the explicit support of the Prussian state. Achard's work proved that sugar could be extracted on an industrial scale from plants that would grow in a temperate climate. Napoleon, who had cut continental access to colonial sugar through his blockades, encouraged production of beet sugar in France, offering bounties and prizes for methods to produce sugar domestically. Inventors and industrialists scrambled to convert agriculture into sugar factories. In France, technicians such as Jean-Baptiste Kerouel, working for industrialists like Benjamin Delessert, refined processes for extracting sugar from beets and set up the first successful French factories in the 1810s. This was more than a technological curiosity. It was a political weapon. If France could make sugar locally from beets, it could blunt British maritime power and the economic leverage that came with control of the cane sugar industry. A nationalist rhetoric attached itself to beet sugar. Self-sufficiency, industrial modernity, continental independence. The Prussian state subsidized plantations and mills. Napoleon's decrees nudged French agriculture toward beets. And later, after the wars, the Zollverein, the customs union formed in 1834 that knitted Prussia and many of the smaller German states into a common tariff and market, provided protection that allowed German beet manufacturers to grow without being undercut by cheap colonial cane. Railways, which spread rapidly across Europe in the 1830s and 1840s, solved one of the beet problem's most intractable features. Beets were bulky and perishable, and fast transport to a local factory was essential. Where canals and rails could be mobilized, beet sugar became viable. The politics that followed were merciless in their pragmatism. Colonial planters, whose livelihoods depended on the long-distance advantage of cane, denounced beet sugar as unfair competition and demanded imperial support. British West Indian planters, who had seen profitability squeezed by emancipation, the Slavery Abolition Act had been passed in the British Empire in 1833, lobbied Parliament for preferential duties and bounties. Metropolitan merchants and industrialists had different interests. In mid-century Britain, the impulse toward free trade, the great commercial argument that also led to the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846, carried with it pressure to reduce protection for colonial sugar and to lower duties that made foreign cane expensive. The result was political friction and a steady reorganisation of who benefited from sugar's economics. French and German states embarked on protectionist and subsidy regimes that privileged beet producers. Britain for a while embraced freer markets that made sugar still cheaper for domestic consumers, but stripped preferential advantages from imperial producers. The industrial chemistry of beet processing matured rapidly. Where early factories produced sugar at high cost, the middle decades of the 19th century saw refinements, systematic liming and carbonation, better diffusion and boiling methods, and a scientific approach to plant breeding that increased the sugar content of beets. Capital now flowed into beet factories. Banks, industrialists, railway interests, and the social profile of sugar changed. No longer the exclusive realm of tropical planters and maritime merchants, sugar became a domestic industry, anchored in provincial towns in northern France, Belgium, parts of Germany and the Russian steppe. Russia, for instance, developed a substantial beet sugar industry that depended, for much of the century, on coerced or semi-coerced labour. The new factories and the land reforms of the 19th century intertwined state policy, agricultural practice and industrial capital. The map of sugar production redrew itself. Cuba and Brazil expanded cane production to fill the void left by Haiti. Britain's Caribbean colonies struggled through emancipation and market competition. The Dutch East Indies under the Cultuurstelsel of the 1830s, a system imposed under Governor-General Johannes van den Bosch, extracted sugar and other commodities from Java by forcing peasants to grow export crops, tying imperial policy to sugar production in a new way. And in Europe, beet factories proliferated. By the late 19th century, the temperate countries had achieved a scale of production that made them major players in the global sugar market. Tariffs, subsidies, and the political weight of industrial capital had made it so. This bifurcation, tropical cane versus temperate beet, was not merely an agricultural shift. It rearranged political alliances, financial flows, and social orders. Plantation owners and colonial merchants found themselves in a defensive coalition, arguing for imperial preference and protective duties. Industrial capitalists, financiers, and many consumers in the metropolis often favoured free trade or at least different patterns of protection that suited factories and railways. The economic consequences were concrete. World sugar prices were subject to new downward pressure, swings intensified by the arrival of beet sugar, and by the opening up of cane production in places like Brazil, which after the Napoleonic disruptions expanded rapidly in the 19th century. As prices fluctuated, plantation economies that had been built on the assumption of scarcity and high prices found their margins thin. The political reaction was familiar: petitions, parliamentary committees, lobbying, but the outcome was varied by country. France and Germany embedded protection and subsidies. Britain, for a long period after the mid-century reforms, embraced lower tariffs, and the British consumer in mills and homes enjoyed the benefit of very cheap sugar. What had been a single commodity with one dominant geography, the tropical plantation, had become two industries with different capital bases, labour regimes and political constituencies. Cane, reliant on vast land holdings and warm climates, remained tied to colonial empires and to debates over labour. Slavery in its abolition, indentured migration, coerced labour systems like those in Java. Beet, in contrast, sat comfortably within the contours of 19th century industrial capitalism. It drew upon railways, chemical engineering, credit from metropolitan banks and the organisational innovations of the factory. In effect, the industrialising nations found a domestic sugar that fit the contours of their broader industrialisation. Temperate crops processed in centralised works, financed by banks, supplied to workers in towns whose diets were already sweetened. It was a neat inversion. An ingredient once imported from distant plantations now had a local face and local factory smoke. The fight between beet and cane would continue into the 20th century. In tariffs, in diplomacy, in the sometimes desperate appeals of colonial planters for imperial sympathy, but by the late 19th century the shape of the global sugar map was clear. The habit of sweetening the daily cup established in the mills and the docks had been reinforced by states and merchants and scientists. Sugar's history in these decades is thus a double history. The intimate domestic micro-history of a spoonful in a worker's mug, the grand macro-history of chartered companies, insurance ledgers and tariffs that shaped empires. It is instructive and oddly comic to observe that a commodity that could make a child's bread taste like summer had also been traded in sums that underwrote fleets and filled parliaments with passionate petitions. When one steps back from the mills and the counting houses, the larger pattern is evident. Sugar, through its journey from field to cup, rewired economies, changed diets, financed empires and provoked national strategies. It became a raw material in the industrial food of the city, a political lever in parliamentary debate, and an object of technological competition in the factories of Berlin, Rouen and St. Petersburg. The continental turn toward beet was born of blockade and necessity. It matured through chemistry and railway engineering, and it landed as a political fact in tariff lists and housewives' budgets. And yet the human scale remained small and persistent. In a Manchester lodging house the year after the West India docks opened, a mother might stir jam into porridge for her child and send him with a tin of sweetbread to the mill. Across the Atlantic, in a London counting house, a merchant might sign a bill that would keep a plantation afloat for another season. In Berlin, a chemist would tweak a clarification method that would make beet sugar whiter and cheaper. These are acts of scale and of minuteness stitched together. Sugar fed the worker, lubricated the economy, and sat at the centre of a web of commerce and policy that made modern globalisation possible. So by the time the 19th century had turned toward its middle decades, oil was both familiar and contentious, a cheap boon at the bottom of society's diet, and a cause for international policy at the top of statesmen's lists. The sweet spoon in the worker's mug had consequences that moved from dockside warehouses to the lexicons of 19th century finance, from the treaty texts that carved out spheres of influence to the local parish lists of pauper relief where sugar loaves were given in rations. It is a small bitter truth in the long story. A commodity measured in sugar barrels and in teaspoons changed how people worked, ate, governed and fought. The refinement in the counting house was echoed in the refinement of the loaf. The tariff in a minister's office translated into a lad's sugar cube at the mill gate. The beet in the Prussian field became, by way of steam and bone char and tariffs, a spoonful in a Manchester tin mug. If the world that manufactured sugar was also a world that manufactured dependence, it did so with a soft, crystalline hand. The politics of tariffs and charters, of ships and insurance, of plantations and factories all came together into the most domestic of acts, the reaching for a spoon. And behind that spoon was an engine, mercantile, financial, imperial, that had no trouble bending law, science, and coercion to keep its wheels turning. In that marriage of household ritual and global strategy, sugar rewrote both palates and geopolitics. The table manners of a family in an English town were, in truth, epiphenomena of treaties and shipping manifests, of chemists' notebooks and dockside ledgers. In the slow hush after the mill whistle, when the city settled for the night and a child's mouth still tasted of jam and tea, the history of sugar was quietly at work, a persistent crystalline force that had remade lives, labour, and the map of the world. For centuries, physicians wrapped sugar in the authority of the ancients and tucked it into their remedies as if sweetness could disguise both cure and commerce. Under the shadow of Galen, whose name presided over medieval and early modern medicine like an old learned patron, sugar arrived in the apothecary not merely as a treat but as a pharmacon, a vehicle, a preservative, a balm. Cordials, thick amber syrups redolent of rosewater and citrus, sat beside the mortar and pestle in Baghdad and Cairo, in Venice and London, and pharmacists measured them out by the dram. In the hospitals of Avicenna's Baghdad and the courts of Renaissance Italy, sugar was praised for its ability to preserve volatile herbs, to make bitter simples palatable, to warm a stomach thought to be cold by the language of humours. It smelled of cloves and citrus, and when it was melted into wine and herbs, it became the bridge between medicine and pleasure. The same concoction you might take for a fever, you might also sip after a feast simply because it tasted like safety. This was not mere sentiment. The logistics of preserving matter before refrigeration turned sugar itself into a technology. Crystallized cane from India and Persia travelled along caravans and later across oceanic routes. It was an ideal preservative because, in concentrated solution, it denied life to microbes through sheer osmotic force. Jam makers in 17th century France and apothecaries in 17th century London both relied on the same principle. Sugar preserved fruit and syrups, and thus preserved for the wealthy a season that could otherwise be eaten only in memory. So sugar came to be seen in learned circles as part of the therapeutic toolkit, a stabilising agent, a flavouring for bitter tonics, a tincture to be trusted. Taste, tradition, and scarcity reinforced one another. When sugar was exotic and dear, when a teaspoon might be an indulgence shared during a solemn feast, its medicinal reputation made practical sense. But the story that followed is a slow, practical rewriting of that comforting belief. As plantations in the Caribbean expanded, as beet sugar technology took root in France during the Napoleonic Wars, as steam-powered mills and improved refining techniques turned sugar into a commodity, the scale shifted. Where once a doctor might prescribe syrup for a cough, factory assembly lines and railways turned that syrup into 1,000 different things, and the old neonatal trust in sweetness faltered into suspicion. It was dentists, more than most physicians, who sounded the first clear alarms as sugar ceased to be rare. Pierre Fauchard, the French surgeon-dentist whose Scene 28 textbook The Surgeon-Dentist established modern dentistry's foundations, had already pointed an attentive finger at confectionery. He noticed that sticky foods lingered, and that those sweet residues invited decay. Those observations, made in the age of powdered wigs, looked tactile and small, sticky crumbs, a child's molar, but they gestured toward a mechanistic explanation that would later be confirmed. By the close of the 19th century, the chemico-parasitic theory of dental caries, articulated most famously by Willoughby D. Miller in the 1890s, replaced moralizing blame with microbial mechanism. Miller, an American dentist and bacteriologist working in Europe, argued that the mouth's microorganisms metabolize as carbohydrate, sucrose, glucose, the saccharin staples, into acids that dissolve tooth enamel. The diagnosis was both simple and devastating in its implications. As societies ate more sugar, cavities would follow. The problem was no longer solely a matter of personal cleanliness, it was systemic. At roughly the same historical inflection, nutrition itself began the long, messy project of becoming a science. The 19th century had been a time of discovery and classification. Vitamins would be isolated only in the early 20th century, but the technologies were changing. Experimental physiology, improved statistical methods, and the rise of epidemiology after the First World War allowed scientists to move from small-scale observational remarks to population-level inferences. As this new nutritional gaze widened, it sought causes for rising epidemics that were emerging as 20th century nations industrialized, coronary heart disease above them all. The mid-20th century is where the story grows argumentative. Ancel Keys, an American physiologist, became a central figure in the 1950s and 1960s with his 7-country study, a sweeping epidemiological project that followed cohorts in the United States, Japan, Italy, Greece, Finland and elsewhere. Keys argued, and his data seemed to show, that populations with diets higher in saturated fat had higher rates of heart disease. His work fit a larger narrative after the Second World War. Diets rich in meat, butter and animal fats seemed to accompany industrial wealth and the diseases of modern life. Keys became both prophet and gatekeeper, and his work shaped the dietary recommendations that governments would adopt. Populations were counselled to reduce saturated fat. Public health campaigns promoted leaner meats and low-fat products. The reductionist logic, one nutrient, one risk, was comforting. It simplified advice, and simplification was a virtue in policy. Not everyone agreed. In Britain, John Yudkin, a metabolic physiologist at Queen Elizabeth College, argued that refined sugar, not saturated fat, was the primary culprit in coronary heart disease and in the emerging global problem of obesity. His 1972 book, Pure, White and Deadly, was part impassioned polemic and part epidemiological argument. Yudkin marshalled cross-country data and emphasised that sugar consumption had risen in parallel with coronary disease and certain cancers. He drew attention to metabolic pathways and the effects of fructose on the liver. He was, however, a lone and increasingly marginalised voice in a field leaning hard against fat. Ancel Keys and others criticised Yudkin. He was lampooned in media and sidelined in the conferences where public policy took shape. The irony was acute. A man who had watched sugars become omnipresent, who had warned against a sweet deluge, found his warnings drowned out by an institutional focus that assumed fat as enemy number one. That institutional focus mattered because policy moves solely and mostly in the direction where scientific consensus points and where commercial interests allow. Sugar was becoming ubiquitous in the 20th century, but its ubiquity arrived inside a fog of contested evidence. When the US Senate, nutritionists and food industries argued about what to recommend, the dominant narrative, avoid fat, put sugar off the table. Meanwhile, the factories were humming. Production economics had a deadening effect on moral urgency. When an industry employs thousands, when a commodity underpins rural economies across the tropics and the temperate beet fields of Europe, the social machinery resists abrupt moral judgments. Evidence helps send policy, but evidence can be delayed, reframed or transformed. And so the 20th century witnessed a parallel history. While some scientists tinkered with hypotheses about sugar's metabolic effects, factory belts transformed sugar into something else entirely. The pre-existing uses, cordials, syrups, preserves, remained, but were supplemented by a flood of new applications made possible by refrigeration, canning and chemical preservation, by the rise of multinational corporations with centralized brands, and by an advertising revolution that shaped appetites in ways the apothecary could never dream. The technical history is almost boring in its effectiveness. Canned fruit, a technique invented by Nicolas Appert in the early 19th century, spread widely. Pasteurization and improved sterilization allowed milk and condensed milk to be transported. Mechanical refrigeration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries moved perishables across greater distances. Industrial sugar refining and the vacuum pan cut costs. Centrifugal machines sped crystallization. These were not glamorous inventions, but each reduced the cost of making something sweet, stable and portable. When sugar could be kept and packaged cheaply, it could be layered into cereal, into bread, into jam jars shipped inexpensively across rail networks, folded into factory-made pastries, bound into candies wrapped in cellophane and sold on sidewalks in Johannesburg, Sao Paulo and Shanghai. The 20th century also witnessed a tectonic rearrangement of taste through advertising and branding. The radio and later the television set, the living room altars of modernity, became the channels through which companies taught millions what meals could look like. Breakfast cereals, once a healthful reformist project of 19th century doctors promoting blandness, were remade into sugary spectacles. Mascots, jingles and cartoon tie-ins sold sweetened cereals to children and convenience to busy parents. Tony the Tiger roared for Frosted Flakes beginning in the 50s. Mascots and jingles promised energy, health and fun in a single colourful box. General Mills, Kellogg's, Post, Aeon. They all learned to tailor sugar's texture into branding. Soft drinks were the other axis of transformation. Coca-Cola, patented by John Pemberton in 1886 in Atlanta, had been a local curiosity. By the mid-20th century, it had become a global signifier. The company's logistical genius, building local plants to avoid the cost of shipping syrup across oceans, bottling close to consumption, and supplying the American soldier abroad during World War II, created distribution networks that would outlast empires. Pepsi followed, and together they fetched markets across continents. Carbonation, sugar, or later high-fructose corn syrup, and mass bottling made sweet drinks an everywhere product. Vending machines in school corridors, convenience stores on every corner, stadium sponsorships, and advertising that equated fizzy sweetness with modern life. That modern life was globalized in the literal sense. Containerization in the 1950s and 1960s and faster shipping allowed raw cane to move more cheaply. Better roads and trucks brought refined sugar inland. But the movement was not only in crates and barges. Taste cultures migrated. American fast food chains, McDonald's, born into expansion in the 1950s and 1960s, carried sodas and sugared buns into cities that previously had different culinary rhythms. In the post-war decades, multinationals from Nestle to Mars, from Kellogg's to Kraft, conflated convenience with familiarity. A chocolate bar designed in Chicago could be marketed in Nairobi with the same wrapper in a global advertising campaign. The entwining of sugar with convenience food transformed sugar into a structural part of the modern diet. Technology also altered sugar's chemical presence. In the United States, a major industrial shift in the late 20th century replaced much cane sugar in processed foods with high-fructose corn syrup, HFCS. Advances in enzyme chemistry in the 1960s and 70s made it possible to convert glucose-rich corn syrup into a mixture with a higher fructose content that mimicked sucrose's sweetness. HFCS was cheap, thanks in part to corn subsidies and tariffs. So by the 80s, soft drinks and many processed foods were sweetened with it. The substitution was a logistical and economic decision, but it had health implications. Fructose is metabolized in the liver differently than glucose, and researchers began to ask whether that biochemical divergence mattered for obesity and metabolic disease. Whether HFCS is intrinsically worse than sucrose remains contested in scientific circles, but the point of the logistics is clear. Economic incentives reshaped the diet. As sugar slid into every seam of the industrial diet, the world's public health indicators registered a slow shift. The obesity epidemic that would come to dominate global health conversations was not the product of a single cause, but the result of a nutrition transition. As incomes rose and urbanization accelerated in the late 20th century, traditional diets based on grains and vegetables often gave way to energy-dense, processed foods, high in sugar, salt and fat. The epidemiologist Barry Popkin and others mapped that transition, its velocity and its consequences. In a few decades, nations that had once suffered hunger were now confronting the twin burdens of undernutrition and obesity, often within the same household. The sweetness was everywhere. It tasted like convenience, like celebration, like childhood. It also tasted like an industrial commodity, whose corrosive effects were distributed unevenly. And as the evidence mounted that sugar was not merely a guilty pleasure but a public health problem, the institutions that had the power to act found themselves entangled with the industries producing the risk. This is where the history becomes less about molasses and steam and more about memos, meetings and money. The sugar industry had been politically organised since the 19th century. In the United States, the American Sugar Refining Company, known colloquially as the Sugar Trust, had, around the turn of the 20th century, embodied the sort of consolidation that defined the Gilded Age. The Havemeyer family and their partners controlled vast refining capacity and exercised immense political influence. Later, sugar producers across the globe, from Tate and Lyle in Britain to the beet producers of northern France and the cane plantations of Brazil, would develop their own forms of corporate power, working national and international policies to secure tariffs, quotas and subsidies. Those policies mattered because they changed relative prices and thereby shaped what manufacturers chose to put in their products. But the politics of sugar became even more pernicious in the way the industry engaged with science. Here the parallels to the tobacco industry's playbook are disconcertingly close. Documents unearthed and analysed by historians and public health researchers in recent years show that the Sugar Research Foundation, later the Sugar Association, moved actively to shape the scientific narrative in the mid-20th century. In 1965, the Foundation reached out to 3 prominent nutrition researchers at Harvard, commissioning a review of the evidence on sugar and heart disease that would appear in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1967. Internal documents revealed many decades later and recounted in a 2016 paper in the BMJ by Kristin Kearns, Laura Schmidt and Stanton Glantz show that the industry's payment, modest by today's standard but symbolically large, was intended to shift attention away from sugar and towards saturated fat as the primary dietary villain in coronary disease. The review that resulted emphasized fat and downplayed sugar. For a generation of policymakers and practitioners, that review became an anchor. It helped fuel the narrative that dietary fat rather than sugar deserved the harshest scrutiny. The strategy was simple and sorrowful. Find friendly researchers, fund convenient reviews, seed doubt, shape the conversation. When John Yudkin insisted sugar was dangerous, he was dismissed and sometimes ridiculed. When the Sugar Research Foundation and allied interests promoted narratives blaming fat, they found an eager audience among manufacturers of low-fat products and among nutritionists who wanted a simple policy lever. The result was a decades-long delay in taking sugar seriously as a contributor to chronic disease. In later decades, the playbook evolved, but not in spirit. Coca-Cola and PepsiCo, along with confectioners and the corn syrup industry, learned that the battlegrounds were not only in the lab, but in the public square and the policy arena. Companies sponsor research, they fund educational initiatives framed as corporate responsibility, and they contribute to think tanks and professional associations. In the 2000s and 2010s, investigative journalists documented that Coca-Cola had quietly funded programs emphasizing physical activity as the primary remedy for obesity, programming that conveniently diverted attention from sugars in beverages. The company's funding of the Global Energy Balance Network, disclosed in 2015 and widely publicized, is a striking example. Groups that presented themselves as independent sometimes turned out to have paltry independence. The notion that weight is solely a matter of energy balance and that exercise could fully compensate for caloric excess found a warm reception in both industry-funded literature and in certain policy circles. It was good PR. It was also scientifically reductive, though lobbying and legal strategies were equally visible. When local governments proposed sugar taxes, from Berkeley, California in 2014 to Mexico's national soft drink tax the same year, industry groups mobilized. They hired lobbyists, ran ad campaigns, argued about regressivity and consumer freedom, and funded studies that promised to show that taxes would have little effect on consumption. The tobacco wars had demonstrated that litigation, legislative capture, and public relations could delay regulation for decades. Sugar interests learned the lesson. In the United States, the sugar lobby worked to preserve protective policies, tariffs, quotas, and price supports that kept domestic sugar prices high. Those policies had political logic. They preserved jobs, maintained farms, kept votes, but they also sustained a market structure that shielded the industry from the blunt forces of global competition and allowed processors and manufacturers to plan around domestic supplies. Internationally, sugar producers resisted global health efforts. When the World Health Organization moved, after decades of careful review, to recommend in 2015 that free sugars be reduced to less than 10%, and ideally to under 5% of total energy intake, industry spokespeople criticised the guidance as premature, as economically harmful, and as bad science. The debate was noisy. Delegations from sugar-exporting nations protested to multilateral institutions. National governments whose economies depended on sugar production lobbied international forums. The effect was not always permanent delay, but it was enough to complicate policy design and to make unilateral public health moves politically fraught. The politics of evidence also transformed the texture of public debate. It's one thing for scholars to argue about causation in peer-reviewed journals. It is another for corporations to seed uncertainty in households whose newspapers carry ambiguous headlines and whose television programming shows happy families drinking sweet sodas. Manufacturing doubt operates at scale. It is a logistical operation. Fund a study here, sponsor a conference there, create an academic fellowship, flood the media with op-eds arguing for personal responsibility. Over time, the public learns a kind of pluralism in which every health claim can be countered by a sponsored scientist. Doubt becomes an industrial product as familiar as brown sugar. There were scandals, public moments when the machinery clanked and caught light. The 2016 BMJ article exposing the Sugar Research Foundation's role in shaping mid-century research was one. Investigative reports in major newspapers about Coca-Cola's funding of organizations that emphasized exercise over diet were another. Public health advocates pointed to these episodes as evidence that the policy landscape had been distorted. But scandal does not always produce immediate policy correction. The industry's logistical advantages, money, legal teams, entrenched supply chains, relationships with governments that rely on sugar employment make reform a prolonged fight. Even as evidence accumulates in peer-reviewed journals showing associations between sugar-sweetened beverages and weight gain, type 2 diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and certain cardiovascular risks, the political system that could regulate production, taxation and advertising often move at a geologic pace. When they do move, the results are instructive. Mexico's tax on sugary beverages in 2014, implemented as part of a broader set of fiscal reforms, showed that even modest taxes could reduce purchases of taxed beverages, particularly among lower-income households, and could nudge manufacturers toward reformulation. Berkeley's 2014 soda tax likewise coincided with declines in sugary drink consumption. The United Kingdom's soft drinks industry levy, announced in 2016 and levied in 2018, used a different lever, a tiered tax that incentivized manufacturers to reduce sugar content in beverages rather than simply pass the cost on to consumers. The fiscal instruments are pragmatic, almost logistical. They alter prices, they change recipes, they change shelf space. They are not moral panaceas, but they illustrate that when policy design uses the fiscal anatomy of markets rather than the slow machinery of persuasion, it can reshape corporate behaviour. Nevertheless, corporations continue to adapt. When taxes bite, products shrink in size. When sugar content is frowned upon, companies reformulate, substitute non-nutritive sweeteners, or rebrand calorie-laden goods as better for you. These are not mere public relations gestures. They are logistical re-engineering. They involve new supplier contracts, new processing steps, different labels, and fresh marketing strategies aimed at both regulators and consumers. The industry's capacity for adaptation partly explains why public health interventions must be iterated and monitored. A one-off tax does not by itself cure an industrially engineered taste for sweetness. The last decades of the 20th and the early years of the 21st century have thus been characterised by a tug-of-war between accumulating science and sophisticated corporate countermeasures. Nutrition science has matured. Randomised controlled trials, longitudinal cohort studies, and mechanistic research on fructose metabolism have all contributed to an evidence base that implicates excess free sugars in a host of chronic conditions. Yet the translation of that evidence into collective action has been uneven, because commercial interests can marshal legal, political and rhetorical capital at a scale public health often lacks. In the end, the history of sugar's scientific perception is a story about time and power. For centuries, sugar's medicinal uses soothed the mind as much as the body. Then industrial abundance turned that revered remedy into an omnipresent ingredient, an economic commodity, and, for many, a health burden. Scientists raised questions, some dismissed them, others were blocked, funded or co-opted. Companies embraced the market opportunities technological advance provided, and then defended their franchises with the techniques of modern politics: funding, lobbyists, litigation and media. None of this was entirely secret. But secrecy is not necessary when you have better access to legislative corridors than a beleaguered public health agency, when your products are embedded in culture, when your claims can be amplified by a willing media marketplace. And the consequences are logistical as much as clinical. Tooth decay, once a dentist's problem, is now a public health issue, with implications for childhood quality of life and for professional dental care systems. Obesity and diabetes are not merely personal failures. They are the outcomes of industrial decisions about recipes, marketing budgets and supply chain contracts. When a multinational chooses the cheapest sweetener and a government chooses to protect domestic producers, those choices ripple across markets, diets and bodies. There is, if we want to end the tale on a gentler, more wakeful note, the recognition that public policy can, and sometimes does, reorganise the logistics of sweetness. Taxes, reformulation mandates, advertising restrictions, particularly those protecting children, labelling rules that require the disclosure of added sugars, and procurement guidelines for schools can all change what gets made and what gets eaten. The vector is simple: make the sweet option less cheap, less marketed to children, less ubiquitous on the school tray and the airport carousel. The Enlightenment dream of regulatory rationality is a slow, halting thing, but it is not absent. Still, it is necessary to admit a final soft truth in the historian's voice. Sugar's story is not only politics and profit. It is also culture, comfort, celebration and memory. Weddings, holidays, childhoods, these have an appetite for sweetness. The political projects of public health therefore face not only corporate supply chains but centuries of social practice that transform sweetness into meaning. That makes regulation delicate. It also makes the historian's job richer, because the problem is not simply supply but desire. So as you lay down and let the last light dim, imagine how the taste of sugar has moved through human history, from apothecary spoon to factory scoop, from a medicinal cordial to a stadium-sized commodity, from an intimate remedy to a global concern. Picture the mills and the trucks, the memos and the studies, the lab benches and the boardrooms. Picture dentists in white coats, scientists in university halls, marketers with the glossy charts and activists with petitions. And hear faintly the clink of glass bottles on a conveyor and the soft, relentless hum of a world that found comfort. And then danger, in a tiny substance that is at once sweet and stubbornly political. Sleep on that for a while. The rest of the story, how societies decide to live with sweetness, to regulate it, to tame it without erasing ritual, will come if they choose to study logistics as carefully as they once studied humours. It will come if policy follows evidence more faithfully than money, if markets can be nudged toward health, if, in short, the collective machinery of society can be retooled to reward moderation rather than mere manufacture. Until then, the sugar keeps making itself at the scale of ships and silos, and the science keeps trying to catch up, one carefully measured spoonful at a time. In the dim hush before festival lights bloom, A woman in Varanasi presses into the palm of a child a warm, fragrant laddu, its grainy surface flecked with cardamom and ghee, and in that simple exchange centuries condense sugar ritual identity. Sweets arrive at the centre of ceremony as a permission to be indulgent and devout at once. They are the edible punctuation marks at weddings, the tiny papal indulgences of everyday life, the tangible evidence that the sacred and the social have been made delicious. In the temple courtyards of South Asia, mithai, barfi, jalebi, rasgulla, gulab jamun travel from priestly hands as prasadam, a blessing to be consumed with humility and hurry. Modak is offered to Ganesh at the height of Ganesh Chaturthi, a festival reinvigorated by Bal Gangadhar Tilak in the late 19th century as a vehicle for public assembly. The festival's revival made the sweet dumpling both a devotional act and sometimes a token of nationalist sentiment. In Lucknow and Kolkata, in Kolkata's narrow lanes where sweet shops have been family businesses for generations, the act of buying a box of mithai is itself a small civic ritual. You join the queue, you taste, you pass along gossip, you celebrate births and consolations with the same cloying sugar. Move westward and the story refolds. In the cool tiled courtyard of an Ottoman konak, a plate of baklava is placed under an embroidered cloth. Its phyllo layers, honey thin, contain chopped pistachio like a hidden map. Ottoman palace kitchens at Topkapi trained confectioners in the architecture of layers and syrup. And in Istanbul, Haçabekir opened a shop in 1777 whose locum, Turkish delight, would come to stand for hospitality itself. In the months of Ramadan, fasting and feasting live beside each other, and the end of fast Eid al-Fitr becomes a time for mamul and katayef, the sweet parcels that travel from bakeries to mosques to family homes. Ashura sees halva handed out in large copper pans in parts of the Levant. Sugar becomes here a social lubricant between neighbour and stranger, a means of showing you remember birthdays and mourn anniversaries and can be trusted to feed a stranger. East and Southeast Asia developed a different vocabulary, derived as often from palm sugar as from cane, as often from rice and beans as from syrup, but sugar's presence is no less evident. In China, crystallized sugar decorates New Year offerings. Nian Gao, the sticky rice cake whose name is a pun for rising fortunes, and candied hawthorn on skewers tanghulu sell on winter streets with a crisp snap. Japan's wagashi, delicate confections tied to seasonal aesthetics and the tea ceremony, flourished under the Tokugawa peace when sugar became more available, and confectioners in Kyoto made sweets that matched the precise transient beauty of the tea bowl. Portugal's sailors and missionaries carried cane and techniques to Macau and the Philippines. Pastéis de nata, in a kind of culinary migration, find whispered cousins in the custody flans of Southeast Asia. The Spanish friars in colonial Mexico set up sugar mills and introduced European dairy techniques that, blended with native tastes and abundant fruit, produced galleta and dulce de leche, like inventions across Latin America, the creamy caramel of Calaya and the spooned galletas of Oaxaca. In Europe, the symbolism of sugar moved from medicine to social pageantry to bourgeois habit. Early modern banquets in Renaissance Italy and France prized sugar sculptures, subtleties that rose like architecture from banquet tables, proof that the host could summon what was once rare. By the 19th century, sugar was everywhere. It had followed shipping routes and plantations into common kitchens. Tea in Britain did the rest. Anna, the Duchess of Bedford, made the afternoon tea fashionable in the 1840s, and with it came cakes, scones, jams, and that steady stream of boiled and crystallised sweetness that made the British identity and the sugar trade intimate bedfellows. Marie-Antoine Carême, in the early 19th century, elevated patisserie into haute art, constructing pastry architectures for heads of state and titled hosts. Auguste Escoffier later codified modern haute cuisine, and the patisserie became a public theatre of sugar's technical achievement. Macarons, millefeuilles, petit fours, sweets as social signifiers of refinement. Caribbean sweets tell the story of circulation, of cane, of molasses, of salt air and rum, through the small domestic rituals that sustain identity. The distilleries of Barbados and Jamaica gave birth to Mount Gay. Claims trace its license to 1703. An Appleton estate, with records back to the mid-18th century, and the byproducts of sugar refining molasses became rum, which in turn was a key flavour in Christmas black cake, in rum-infused puddings, and in the boozy breads that anchor celebrations from Bridgetown to Kingston. Here the sweetness is political and personal. Plantations logistics, crop calendars, windward and leeward trade winds, the monthly grind of cane into sugar and molasses supported economies and lives, and the small act of soaking fruit in rum, of lighting a spice cake's flaming brandy, is a ritualization of that vast industrial choreography. After slavery's formal end in the British colonies, the planters seeking labour contracted, transported and indentured more than 1 million workers from South Asia and East Asia across the 19th and early 20th centuries. They carried with them the tastes of home, condensed milk, jaggery, spices, and the sweets they made at the edge of the plantation kitchens were hybrid from the first bite. A barfie sweetened with Caribbean coconut here, a red berry tamarind ball there, coconut fudges scented with cloves and rum that resist easy categorization. Creolization tastes like that. Caribbean rhythms layered over Indian textures and African spice blends. It produces new objects of identity. Trini sweetbreads, Indo-Caribbean barfie, Guyanese black cake imbued with the sticky heritage of church gatherings and plantation smoke. In New Orleans, the beignet, dusted with confectioner's sugar at Café du Monde since mid-19th century trade patterns consolidated the port city's ties to Caribbean and European sugar flows, becomes a morning ritual for locals and a culinary tourist emblem. In Haiti, the revolution that began in 1791 under Toussaint Louverture toppled sugar's planter regime and produced a short, paralysing new chapter. When France, finally recognising Haitian independence in 1825, demanded a crippling indemnity that took decades to pay, Haiti's economy, and the sugar it might have managed for its own people, was reshaped by external claims. Sugar in that history is not just sweet, it is currency, and punitive diplomacy sutured hardship to sweetness. Around the world, sweets become icons of national belonging. A stroke of sugar can be a claim to place. The contested histories of rasgulla in India, where states and confectioners squabble over origin stories, the Greek and Turkish claims to baklava, the tiny towns of Sulmona in Italy, which long celebrate confetti almonds as local pride. These food litigations are soft power in a sugar-glossed wrapper. Sweets anchor memory, honeyed apples at Rosh Hashanah ask for a sweet new year, Korean teok at weddings marks the social contract. In the Highlands of Scotland, tablet are crumbly milk and sugar fudge, and shortbread connect kitchen practice to clan kitchens. Sugar crosses social registers because it was simultaneously rare and then mass-produced. It became a marker of status, and then a marker of ordinary comfort, of surplus and of scarcity, often all at once. Where sugar is woven into identity, it is also a canvas for creativity. The colonial encounter is the engine of much of that creativity, and not in any single direction. Portuguese convent sweets since the 17th century Lisbon passed recipes to their colonial outposts and returned with New World ingredients. The egg yolk custards of pastéis de nata have parallels in Filipino flan. Spanish nougats travelled to the Philippines as turon and then intermingled with local tastes. French colonial pastry in Indochina birthed the Vietnamese ban flan. Chinese bakers in Southeast Asia adapted their fillings and sweetening agents to palm sugar and coconut milk, and in time these sweets fed new diasporas, spreading yet again. The movement of people, forced and voluntary, left sugar-laden fingerprints on the global plate. It is a delicious palimpsest. So when public health finally turned its gaze back to sweetness in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, it did so into an already intimate, embedded cultural field. Policy has to move among the rituals, not merely press a fiscal button. The recent decades have seen a bouquet of governmental responses that aim to curb added sugars and sugar-sweetened beverages, each shaped by political economy and cultural reality. Mexico, battered by rising obesity and diabetes, introduced a tax on sugary beverages in 2014. An excise designed to increase prices and shrink purchases, and early evaluations found a measurable decline in purchases in aggregate and a large decline among lower-income households. Berkeley, California in 2014 became the first US city to pass a penny per ounce tax, and within a year studies observed significant reductions in sugary drink consumption there. The United Kingdom framed its intervention differently. The soft drinks industry levy, announced in 2016 and implemented in 2018, used a tiered excise structure, higher charges for drinks with more sugar, and this design's cleverness was its explicit incentive for reformulation. Industry quickly reduced sugar content in many product lines rather than pay the levy, labelling and advertising restrictions as siblings to taxation. Chile is the clear example of muscular packaging and marketing law. A 2016 suite of regulations required front-of-pack black stop sign-style warnings for foods high in sugar, sodium or saturated fats, restricted sales inside schools and banned marketing to children. The result was not a magic wand that eliminated obesity, of course, but it did change the visual ecology of grocery aisles and reduce child-directed exposure to unhealthy product advertising. Other countries have experimented with traffic light labels, like the Voluntary Food Standards Agency schema in the UK in the 2000s, and Australia's Health Star Rating system, introduced 2014, has sought to guide consumers, though its voluntary nature and industry-designed algorithms have drawn critique. Many nations have tightened school nutrition standards. The United States Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act of 2010 brought new meal standards and placed limits on competitive foods in schools, bans on sugary drinks being among the outcomes. These approaches produce outcomes and provoke pushback in equal measure. Evidence converges on a modest but consistent truth. Well-designed fiscal measures reduce purchases of taxed beverages and prompt industry reformulation. Clear labelling reduces the salience of unhealthy products and helps some consumers make different choices. School standards reduce in-school availability of sugary products. But limitations abound. Taxes can be regressive in appearance. Low-income households spend a greater share of income on beverages, but they also produce greater proportional reductions in consumption among the same groups. When revenues are used to fund health programs, the regressivity argument softens. Moreover, industry adapts. Beverage companies reformulate, often substituting non-nutritive sweeteners, alter portion sizes, relocate marketing budgets, or fund community programs as a kind of reputational insurance. In the United States and Europe, the beverage and sugar industries have marshaled trade lobbyists, legal challenges, and public relations campaigns. In 2017, the Cook County soda tax became a cautionary theatre. An ambitious local levy was repealed amidst fierce retail backlash and a barrage of anti-tax messaging funded by deep-pocket beverage interests. Industry also pursued self-regulation, voluntary pledges like the US Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative, in hopes of staving off stricter government rules. Trade politics complicate regulation, because sugar is not only breakfast jam, but a commodity whose flows are governed by tariffs, subsidies, and international agreements. The North American Free Trade Agreement reshaped sugar flows between the United States and Mexico in the 1990s. NAFTA's changes to sugar markets have been invoked repeatedly in disputes. The European Union's sugar regime, long a lattice of quotas and supports under the Common Agricultural Policy, was reformed and quotas abolished in 2017, with ripple effects in global prices and producer strategies. Agricultural subsidy systems in the United States and the European Union have long distorted incentives, making certain crops economically preferable and constraining the kind of dietary shifts public health might want to encourage. Brazil's pro-alcohol program of the 1970s, created in response to oil shocks and meant to expand ethanol production from sugarcane, distorted cane markets in another direction, tying fuel policy to the fate of the sugar landscape. In short, when public health asks for lower sugar, it must contend with the entire infrastructure that makes sugar cheap, plentiful, and politically defended. If the present is a messy overlay of ritual, corporate power, and public policy, the future offers many near-term hedges, and one large moral question: what do we do with the past? Technically, there are alternatives that reduce the caloric burden of sugar without asking the world to be joyless. Non-nutritive sweeteners have long histories. Saccharin in the 19th century, aspartame discovered in the 1960s, and approved for broad use in the early 80s, sucralose, stevia, and a host of sugar alcohols and novel sweeteners, and they deliver intense sweetness with few or no calories. They permit reformulation strategies that preserve flavour while lowering measured sugar, but they carry trade-offs. Public debate and emerging research about effects on the gut microbiome, on appetite regulation, and on long-term metabolic outcomes leave some scientists circumspect. For consumers, they promise immediate relief at the potential cost of perpetuating high-sweet preference. There is also the pragmatic political calculus. Replacement sweeteners allow industry to claim success while shifting consumption patterns that remain oriented towards sweetness rather than whole foods. Agricultural alternatives and supply-side transformation are often less sexy in headlines but more consequential. Regenerative cane agriculture, techniques that preserve soil carbon, reduce burning and mechanise harvest to reduce particulate pollution, that integrate agroforestry and biodiversity corridors, can lessen cane's environmental footprint. Certification schemes such as Bonsucro, established in the late 2000s, set measurable standards for water use, labour rights and greenhouse gas accounting, and some mills in Brazil, Thailand and Australia have adopted greener practices and cogeneration systems that use biogas to power plants. But sustainable certification is partial. A small minority of global sugar comes from certified higher standard producers, and the price premiums seldom reach the most vulnerable workers on the plantation. Without structural market changes, green sugar risks becoming a boutique commodity for demand in wealthier markets rather than a pathway to systemic justice. Reparations and redress are the blunt, necessary instruments that attend to sugar's moral ledger. Historians have been explicit. The 19th century abolition settlements matter. The British Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 freed enslaved people in many British colonies but compensated owners with about £20 million, redistributed from the British Treasury over generations. Those payments entrenched wealth among plantation elites and their metropolitan investors. France's 1825 demand that Haiti pay indemnity for recognition of independence debt strangled the first black republic for decades. In 2013, the Caribbean community, CARICOM, established a reparations commission to catalogue harms and press for apologies, restitution and development assistance from former colonial powers. In dozens of public hearings and publications since then, the commission has argued that slavery's economic residue and the continued disadvantage it produced deserves collective remedy. These are not mere symbolic gestures. They are requests for structural change, debt relief, targeted investment in health and education, land restitution, and funds for community infrastructure rooted in historical accountability. How might reparations work in the sugar field? Several plausible pathways exist. One is fiscal. Adopt sugar excises whose revenue is earmarked for community funds in territories whose development was retarded by colonial plantation systems, Haiti, Jamaica, Barbados, Guyana, Mauritius. A second is legal and institutional, investment in land reform programs that return or redistribute colonial plantations and decayed estates to cooperative smallholders, paired with financing and technical support to shift production to diversified, regenerative agriculture. A third is cultural, historical, publicly funded truth commissions, museums and curricula that make visible the tangled record of sugar, slavery and corporate profiteering, the kind of public history UCL's Legacies of British Slave Ownership database and the Slave Voyages project have begun to reveal. In practical terms, reparations might mean long-term endowments for public health systems in the Caribbean, scholarship funds for descendants of enslaved people, and preferential trade terms for non-export commodity diversification. There is a politics of possibility here. Policymakers can combine demand-side nudges with supply-side realignments. Sugar taxes, when set as meaningful excises, enough to raise retail prices by 20% or more, change behaviour. When structured as manufacturer levies, they encourage reformulation. And when the revenue is transparently invested in health, education and local agriculture, the social contract grows stronger. Front-of-pack warning labels, clear, mandatory, not voluntary, help consumers at the point of purchase and reduce industry's ability to disguise unhealthy compositions. Advertising restrictions that specifically protect children's attention spaces, television, digital platforms, schools, cut the lifelong marketing advantage that companies have bought. Simultaneously, subsidies for fruit and vegetable production, redirecting perverse agricultural subsidies away from surplus sugar production and toward fresh food, would rebalance price signals that currently make sugar-laden processed foods the default for many households. But this is only half the repair job. Citizens and historians matter. Historians must keep telling the full story, the shipping manifests, the compensation ledgers, the corporate minutes that show how industry shaped research agendas and public messaging over decades. The work of Kearns and colleagues that exposed mid-20th century sugar industry interference in nutritional research is part of a larger archival truth-telling that must be amplified, integrated into school textbooks, narrated in public radio and memorialized in museums. Historians can partner with lawyers and activists to turn archives into evidence for restitution claims. Citizens can demand that revenue from sugar taxes fund local clinics and nutritional education, that supermarkets carry real fruit discounts rather than temporary price promotion of ultra-processed goods, and that public procurement standards favour low-sugar meals in hospitals and schools. On the agricultural front, a just transition for workers in the sugar complex must be central. Many plantations are communities. They are places where generations have worked and lived and where economies still hinge on a single crop. Abruptly dismantling the industry without social safety nets would be cruel. Instead, transition funds, financed by a mix of sugar levies, company contributions and international climate finance, could retrain workers for diversified agriculture, support co-op farming and underwrite the early losses that come with crop transition. The gig of justice has to be practical, rebuilding irrigation and storage for fruits and vegetables, guaranteeing market access through procurement contracts, and investing in rural education and health. Certification schemes can be part of the architecture, but only if they are backed by enforceable labour protections and transparent benefit-sharing models that let the premiums reach the field worker, not merely the global brand. As we imagine a future with less sugar and more justice, we must also be honest about individual agency and system constraints. Telling a child that cake will disappear will not change a culture. Reconciling a community to the past requires money, law and ritual, yet small acts matter too. A mother in Kingston deciding to bake a smaller fruitcake each Christmas, a metropolitan museum creating a gallery that tells the history of sugar and empire, a municipality using soda tax revenue to fund free school meals. These are the quiet, cumulative moves that make a public narrative change visible. And industry will adapt, as it always does. The goal of public policy should be to channel that adaptation toward lower harm and higher fairness, not to leave corporations the sole arbiter of what the future tastes like. So where does sweetness go in the end? It becomes smaller, more intentional, and more honest about its origins. It is not starved into disappearance. It is integrated into a foodscape where sugar is neither a default preservative nor an unacknowledged subsidy. The baker in a small town balances tradition with a new ingredient list. The school canteen refuses to stock drinks that are the modern equivalent of a daily ration of industrial sugar. A sugarcane co-op in Sao Paulo participates in a Bonsucro-like certification and sells to a domestic market that pays a premium for sustainable practice, reinvesting the margin into community clinics and reforestation. Reparative projects are messy and slow. The legal claims of island states take years to resolve. The moral claims take longer still. But each filing, each public hearing, each museum label is a stitch in the long repair. The final irony is sweet. The commodity that once fueled empires, that paid off creditors and then demanded indemnities from the newly freed, that underwrote an industrial revolution and then a modern disease burden, might yet be the instrument of a modest global justice. A sugar tax can fund a clinic. A reformulation can lower a child's risk of diabetes. A truth-telling museum can alter a tourist's understanding of a port city. None of this is dramatic in the old sense. It is incremental, painfully bureaucratic and often unlovely. It is also, in its slow procedural way, the remaking of sugar's story from pasquinade to promise. And so when the candles are almost out and a last bite of pastry rests on a saucer, think of the long voyage that brought that bite to your palm. The soil and the mill, the shipping manifest and the brick oven, the chartered ship and the public health bulletin, the small rituals that make strangers human to one another. Taste that history and perhaps taste the possibility that we can make sweetness not only less harmful to our bodies and earth, but also more honest and fair toward the people who shaped it. Tomorrow the world will spin with the same appetite we have always had. In the meantime, we can choose to reframe the rituals, rewrite the rules, and replant the fields in ways that bring better health and recompense to the table. Sleep on that slow hope. It is, after all, a very human thing to want something sweet, and to want finally for that sweetness to be deserved.